Hello, friends. My grandfather is turning over in his grave at the moment that I am doing this video. For those who follow my channel, you know I am from an Irish-American family, and the name Oliver Cromwell is one of, if not the most hated names you can say in the Republic of Ireland, and some parts of Northern Ireland. But as I have now begun discussing the monarchy of England and such, I have to talk about Oliver Cromwell. But as always, friends, if we're returning to the channel, I ask you to please like, share, and comment. Also, just to make a point on the commenting, I love the comments, but please keep it appropriate. Someone recently left a very long and interesting comment. I really wanted to read it, but I couldn't read the whole thing because they decided to talk very inappropriately about someone in it, which, again, please be appropriate. So, because of that, the whole comment was deleted. Please keep it appropriate, folks. I am a New Yorker. We curse like sailors, believe me, I know. But there's a time and place for everything. Thanks. Also, if you're new to the channel, please subscribe. I have new content up daily. And now let's get into the video. Oliver Cromwell was born in Huntingdon in Cambridgeshire, England on April 25th, 1599. The second oldest child of Robert Cromwell and Elizabeth Stewart. He was the descendant of Thomas Cromwell. For those of you who do not know who Thomas Cromwell was, let me make a quick elaboration. Thomas Cromwell was the man behind Henry VIII. He had succeeded Thomas Wolsey as Henry's chief minister and was pivotal leader in the creation of the Anglican Church. But the king would have Thomas executed, mainly as a scapegoat in a political situation. But Oliver was possibly also connected to the royal house of Stuart due to his family's connection to the Scottish Presbyterian Church and his relatives who were wealthy landowners. Oliver was baptized into the Anglican Church, but in the mid-1610s he found himself going to Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge, which was a very heavy Puritan university which followed Puritan system of beliefs. This is what began to push the young Cromwell into the Puritan faith. But his father passing away in 1617 forced him to return back to his family in Huntingdon. He would go on to inherit all the lands and begin to broker marriages between his sister and notable individuals, as was the tradition for bourgeois families of the time. He'd be elected to Parliament from 1628 to 1629. But he would be dismissed when King Charles I dissolved Parliament to begin what became known as the Personal Rule, an 11-year period in which the king ruled without Parliament and used medieval law to get him what he needed to run England. At the beginning of Personal Rule, Cromwell will become very ill. He'll push through all of the illnesses, but then he and his family would leave Huntingdon and move to St. Ives, which was a small hamlet in Cambridgeshire. Now, at this point, his fanatical beliefs in Puritanism began. Now, after his struggle with illness, he believed it was God's will that he had to be cleansed of his sins and suffer. And he did not like how the Church of England was adopting many Roman Catholic practices and beliefs. So he actually attempted in 1637 to move with his wife Elizabeth and their 7 children to the Connecticut colony in the New World, which had ironically become full of Puritans from Massachusetts colony and the Calvinists who were settling in Connecticut. However, it's believed due to debts or private business affairs, Cromwell was stopped from his departure to the New World. However, he would be elected to Parliament now for Cambridge in 1640. The king's personal rule had been most effective up to this point. Presbyterians in Scotland had begun a rebellion against the crown, though. They believed, much like Puritans, the crown was slowly sliding the United Kingdom, it wasn't the United Kingdom at this point, back into the Catholic Church. So under the command of the Earl of Leven, the Scots raised an army of 20,000 men, called the Covenanters. Now, the king needed to raise an army to combat this threat. His medieval tax laws were simply not enough to get him the men he needed to fight. So he called Parliament in order to raise the funds and troops to put down the rebellion. This parliament would be known as the Short Parliament, as it would only last 3 weeks. When the king realized he would not get what he wanted, he dissolved the House again and forced the funds through other places to raise the army. The Covenanters would won the war that became known as the Bishops' War, and the king had to deliver concessions. After the dismissal of the Short Parliament, something encouraged Cromwell to move his family to London, and that something would appear later that year when the king called Parliament back. So now, when we think of Parliament of England today, we have two sides. The Prime Minister is on one side and the opposition is on the other. The Prime Minister is the head of government. In 1640, Parliament was simply a legislator. It of course had leadership like any other legislator did, but the executive powers of the government rested with the king, who had an extremely, let's say, liberal use of the royal veto against Parliament's bills. This parliament will be known as the Long Parliament, one in which Cromwell allied with most of the nobility in the house due to his familiar and religious connections. The house continued to send bills to the king demanding he relinquish power, remove ministers, and so on. The king had recalled a man named Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford, so he would have a political ally in these turbulent times. However, Strafford had been committing nothing short of terrorism and atrocities while serving as Lord Deputy of Ireland, and Parliament called for his impeachment. Now, Strafford was somewhat of a loudmouth, and at the Royal Council told the king he had an army in Ireland that he could bring to England to end the parliamentarian reign. But the notes to the meeting got back to the Parliament, and his impeachment for a misdemeanor then turned into a declaration of treason against the government of England. Strafford would be executed. After a few more months, the king would attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament. Then when he failed, he moved the royal family himself to Hampton Courts, then to Windsor Castle. Now, this is when tension rose when Parliament delivered their 19 propositions, a way for the power of the government to be shared between the king and Parliament. This was finally what pushed the war into setting off, especially when the king tried to take the city of Hull in northern England to gain arms and weapons for his army that he had been raising. This set off the English Civil War. The whole point was the royalist idea, or the Cavaliers, was that the king was absolute and he was chosen from God. But the parliamentarians, or the Roundheads, believed he was just a man. Now, it's at this point Cromwell becomes an officer in the parliamentarian army. He raised a cavalry troop in Cambridge, with which he actually began to raid the king's supply lines to Cambridge, which the king desperately needed for money and other such necessities. But he arrived too late to the first large-scale battle of the war at Edgehill on October 23rd, 1642. The battle was inconclusive, but it set things up for a concerning tone as the royalists attempted to paint it as their victory. Cromwell was then placed in the army of the Earl of Manchester in East Anglia. He was very successful in his commands, especially at the Battle of Gainsborough, and became a colonel in the force known as the Eastern Association, which was sort of the force responsible for the war on the eastern coast of England. The next time we would see anything of note from Cromwell, he is already a lieutenant general in the Eastern Association at the Battle of Moorestown in July of 1644. Now, at this battle, the Parliamentarian and Covenanters united and crushed the Royalist Cavalier forces commanded by the king's nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine. But this is where a big change occurs, because when Rupert's force collapsed, Cromwell and Sir Thomas Fairfax were infuriated that the Roundhead forces did not take the advantage of the situation of the Cavaliers retreating. But it was because they were using medieval armies in a pseudo-new kind of war. All the armies were raised by local lords. Most were peasants turned soldiers, being commanded by virtually politicians. So, Parliament, after the battle, passed the Self-Denying Ordinance. The job of this ordinance was to separate politicians from command of the army, specifically so the army wasn't commanded by a committee. But another thing happened. Lord Thomas Fairfax and Cromwell were given a directive from the ordinance, and it was to make the army a legitimate professional army. So they began a period of training their soldiers and reorganizing the armies into what became known as the New Model Army, which is the roots of the modern British Army, which is why the British Army is called the British Army and not the Royal Army. Lord Thomas Fairfax in command, with Oliver Cromwell as not only the chief of all cavalry, but also the deputy commander of all forces. On June 14th, 1645, the New Model Army of 13,000 men met with the Cavalier Army, led by the King of 7,400 men. The New Model Army then crushed the Royal Army. The tactics of wearing red tunics worked for the New Model Army. Their morale did not break while the Royalist forces collapsed and ran. Cromwell's cavalry crushed Prince Rupert's horsemen, and then they would go on a month later, finally crushing the remaining Royalist forces the king had at the Battle of Langsport. All the rest of the war will be the king defending and losing cities. On May 5th, 1647, the king surrendered, but to the Scottish, not parliamentarian forces. The English would get the king back in their control, and the House of Commons then wanted to disband the army, mainly because they weren't able to pay for it. But the army refused to disband, and Cromwell attempted to negotiate with them, but this failed as well. Cromwell then brought new terms to the king, and the two for a time were working together on a fair compromise between the house and the king. Next video we'll be discussing the Second, Third, and Irish uprisings, as well as Cromwell's ascension into madness as Lord Protector of the realm. Thanks for watching. Hope if you enjoyed it, you'll like, share, and comment. And if you're new to the channel, I invite you to please subscribe and join our quickly growing community. And we'll see you in the next one.